Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. That was an amazing talk, I think. I was a bit surprised to find I'm only like one of 3 data scientists in this room. But it's pretty cool to be up here sharing with you all what I've learned about experimentation. A bit about my background. I started doing offline experiments when I was a social science researcher in grad school. I then went to Etsy, where I did A/B testing there. And now I work at a company called DataCamp on the growth team. DataCamp does data science online education, and the growth team is essentially our experimentation squad. So I thought it would be helpful in this talk to start with going over some of the steps of the experimentation process. And the first step here is prioritizing. We've heard some about prioritizing tests today, and it can be a very big challenge. I really like something that the Etsy CEO would say, not necessarily about experimentation, but prioritizing in general. And he talked about the worthwhile many, vital few versus the worthwhile many. And looking it up before this talk, I actually found out the more common saying is the vital few versus the trivial many. But I really like the worthwhile many instead, because with prioritizing for experiments, you can't do everything. And the things you aren't doing, it's not because they're not important or they wouldn't make an impact. It just maybe would not be as impactful as these other things. So we'll start with how do we prioritize all these great test ideas we might have. The next step, when you've prioritized your idea, is actually creating them. So fleshing them out some more, engineering, implementing them, design, working on it, and so on. Next, we'll do a guideline for analyzing. So Lizzie just shared a lot of great kind of rules and why you don't want to peek and do these other things. So I'll just add one more in there. And then finally, decision making. How do we take the results that we got from our experiment and use that into deciding what we do next? So first, prioritizing. Let's say we had 3 ideas at DataCamp to increase registration. DataCamp, as I said, online education. It's a subscription product, both B2C and B2B. And registration is one of those first steps in the funnel, just signing up. Let's say I'm thinking, all right, what about preloading our registration modal on our learning platform? So if people come, say from Google, they find themselves on our learning platform, they decide they really like it, and they click the sign up button. By preloading that will appear instantaneously instead of maybe if you're on a 3G phone in India, taking a few seconds to load because it's loaded right when the page loaded itself. All right, well, how about adding recommended courses to the top of the page? Maybe right now we have our introduction courses, but would it be better to pick some other courses and maybe do some language around how these are recommended by us or our users? And finally, what about doing a test of just revamping the course page? So DataCamp has over 220 courses. The layout of these pages in general are similar, although of course the description of the course and the chapters are different. So how about targeting that? So how do we decide between these really good ideas? Well, one option is what the Microsoft experimentation team calls the HIPPO, which stands for the highest paid person's opinion. Some of you might be familiar with this, right? So that would be just that person saying, you know what, I like that idea. Let's try that one. And that's not totally invaluable. Like, hopefully they got to their highest, high-paid position because they have a record of achieving good results. They have domain knowledge and all of that. So it's not saying intuition is not valuable here. But what's another way we could do it? So I would say try to estimate if your test works, how many new conversions would you get per day? So best case scenario, what would the impact be on your site overall? How do you find this out? First, you start with some historical data. What's the population of the test? So as you might imagine, testing something on your homepage, if that works, that's probably going to have a much bigger impact than testing something on this tiny little part that only 100 people see per day. What's the current conversion rate? So if you're targeting registration rate, how many people are registering right now? Finally, what's your estimated increase that you'll have? Now, this is something that's not just a historic number, right? The first 2, hopefully you're tracking. If you're not tracking, don't worry about A/B testing, get those numbers. But what's your estimated increase? That's a little more fuzzy. And I think there was some great ideas earlier in today of how you could use user testing, as we heard from Tammy yesterday, applying psychology principles, just making sure not to do it from the clickbait headlines and so on. And finally, you multiply all of those to get the number of new daily conversions. So let's take an example. All right, we had our 3 test ideas. So let's say I pulled, and these are fake numbers, but these are the number of visitors we get per day. So if I was to only use this to prioritize a test, I would say, great, the learning platform has the most. Let's do that one. Wait, let's look at the conversion rate. Oh, wow, it turns out that the search page does much better right now at generating new registrations. All right, so if we were just using that, we'd go with that page. But we'll take our final piece of the puzzle and get that estimated impact. And now, if we multiply those all together, we'll see that it turns out the course page is the one that we would expect to have the biggest positive impact. So we'd say 120 new conversions per day. Now, in this case, these aren't orders of magnitudes apart on the daily rate. But if you think about this, if you multiply this out to a year, that actually could be a pretty big difference. And this is sometimes we would find for our tests, again, we have some great ideas, but wow, this one might, even if it worked great, even if it got a 15%, 20% increase in registration rate, maybe that would be 300 a month. This other test, all it needs is a 2% increase, and we're gonna get 3,000 a month. Now let's go on to the creating the test part. So my first guideline here is to run a power analysis. So as Lizzie mentioned, one concern you have with experimentation is peaking, so just checking every day if it's significant. But how do you know when you come up with that ideal stopping point? And this is where you use power. So significance is about avoiding a false positive, saying there's a difference when there's not. Power is about avoiding a false negative. So if there's an effect of this size, you want it to have 80% power, and that means there's an 80% chance you will detect it. So this means you won't run a test in vain. Because imagine if you ran this, say, after you run an experiment, you might find out, oh, wow, we would have had to have a 50% increase in this metric to detect it in 2 weeks. We just think there might have been a 10%. Why did we run this test? And so this, again, will tell you how long do you need to run it for. How do you do a power calculation? There are a lot of tools out there. One I like is Booking's power calculator. So this might look like, wow, it's a lot of numbers, but let's break it down. So we're just using the numbers we calculated in that prioritizing step. We start with what's our current conversion rate on our site. We then say, what's the impact we expect to have? How many people do we have visiting? And finally, it will spit out, you should run your test for 7 days. So again, this means if truly there is a 3% increase from the control to the treatment, there's an 80% chance that you'll detect that if you run your test for a week. Now, how do we decide what changes to try? So we might think of, let's say we put on it might be a product manager or growth, and we put on our hats and we say, what could improve the registration rate on the course page? What about adding a registration form right on the page so you don't have to click a button? Sounds good. Adding user testimonials. We know that social proof is pretty powerful. Preloading the registration modal. We had that idea for campus. Why don't we try it on this page? Adding company logos. We also are a B2B business, so a different kind of social proof. Adding a video. We're an interactive online learning platform. Let's show that to people. Why not all of them? These are all, maybe great ideas. There's some evidence behind them, maybe from user testing, psychology research. Let's just throw that all and see if it works. Well, the problem is 2 months later, after you've done all this engineering effort and you've run your test for a week, you go, oh no, we spent all this time and registration rate didn't go up. Data scientists, please, why didn't this work? And your data scientist is probably going to look like this. I have no idea. Now, why are they being so unhelpful? Well, the problem is when you bundle all of that stuff together, it's really hard or even impossible to figure out which part didn't work. Was it an interaction between things? Was it that actually 4 out of the 5 were really positive, but one of them was so negative it dragged everything down? You really don't know. And so my next guideline is to work on smaller incremental tests where you're looking at one thing at a time. So these are some slides from Dan McKinley, who used to be principal engineer at Etsy and started there when they were first doing experimentation. So he talks about Etsy 2008. They weren't experimenting. This is what their engineering on their product cycle would look like. They'd have an idea, they'd implement it, and they'd release it. Very normal. Etsy starts testing in 2012. They actually keep pretty much the same process. They just add an A/B test between the coding and the releasing. And that release has a question mark because maybe the A/B test shows, oh, it didn't have a positive impact or it had a negative, don't release it. But again, you still have this really long coding cycle, and it's really hard to work on something for 2 or 3 months and then it doesn't work. You've probably wasted a lot of effort. So instead, he talks about how they shifted to having these smaller cycles where you would have an idea, you'd start validating it, you'd prototype it, and then A/B test. So maybe you're not putting production quality code. Everything should look the same to the user, but maybe on the back end, your engineers are like, oh, I would never write it this way. But as we've heard before, a lot of tests don't have the impact that you would hope they have. You can still learn from them, but you're not going to roll out that code and that test itself. So why worry and why make sure and spend that extra 5 hours, perfecting the back end of something that actually won't ever go live? Do that after you've proven that it works. So let's say we pick one change. We're like, all right, I've heard you, Emily. We're going to add the registration form. This is the one that has the most evidence behind it. So do you just then run it and dump it all on the data scientist? And you say, all right, we ran this experiment. Data scientists from other part of the business, please analyze it for us. Here's all your data. Well, the problem is to consult the statistician after an experiment is finished is often to merely ask them to conduct a postmortem examination. They can perhaps say what the experiment died of. Why this? Well, again, the sort of problem is just with running and trying all these things and seeing what sticks. If you just get this data, a data scientist may find things like, oh, it turns out you were never powered to detect the change that you hoped to make. So a data scientist, having them involved in the whole process can help with a couple things. They can make sure you're tracking the right metrics. You don't want to run a test that is, say, it's maybe looking for registration, but we really care about how many people at least click the button, and so we can tell where in the funnel do they drop off. And if it turns out you aren't monitoring those button clicks, you can't really do anything about that post hoc. So you sort of wasted some time running this test. They can help you with that power calculation if maybe there's some more unusual metrics you need to gather data on. They can help iterate on ideas. So that's really, through this creating and speccing process of an experiment, some ways that can be, guidelines can be helpful. So now we go to the analyzing part. Things that have happened at DataCamp since I've joined. So I came in to help build the experimentation analytics system. People are put in both the control and the treatment. So the idea, of course, in experiment, you randomly assign people to either the control or the treatment, not both. We didn't have that in some experiments. People in the experiment have no page views. They're just an experiment event kind of floating along when they should have had a page view and been on our site to enter the experiment at all. People in multiple experiment starts in the same group. They should enter just once, and then we keep following them along, but for some reason, they keep re-triggering the experiment. Experiment starts didn't have cookies. So we had this experiment start that existed, but we had no way to tie that to a user on our site. And people weren't split evenly between the control and treatment. And I'm going to talk about this one a little more later. So what did we do? Our first step was to come up with some A/B testing sanity checks that we should always have. And this meant things that we need to check because we never even considered when we started experimenting. We were like, why would there ever be things with no page views? But if you're not tracking them, you might not notice it until it's too late. So we came up with this document, and what that transformed into was a health metrics dashboard. So now for every experiment, we can track these metrics, and we see whether or not there are lots of cookies without page views or cookies with multiple starts, and we have nicely color-coded for when it's problematic or not. Now this last one here, as I talked about, people aren't evenly split between control and treatment. And what this really means is people aren't split in the way you wanted it. If you wanted it to be 50-50, you want to see that it ends up 50-50. Now, of course, it's unlikely you'll get exactly, say, 9,000 one group and 9,000 the other. So is 9,001 okay? What about 9,002 versus 8,998? How do you tell what's too much? And this is where you can run a proportion test, so a statistical test that will tell you, just as Lizzie was talking about, if everything is working correctly, what's the probability you would have seen this distribution? So that over there on the right is the p-value. And this is Ronnie Kohavi from Microsoft talking about this problem. And why it's important to run a test is he was saying, if you have enough traffic, differences as small as 50.2% instead of 50% can have 1 in 500,000 chance of happening if everything's working well. So you really need to run these checks. Even though that's only 4,000 people different, doesn't seem that much to the naked eye out of 800,000. Well, it turns out if you have this problem, it means there's a bug. Something is going wrong. And it's not just going wrong innocuously. This will often very much skew your metrics. And so a test might look like a big winner or a big loser, but if you go back and you check your sample sizes, you're like, oh, wow, it's not actually that we had this great impact or we had this huge problem. It's that our test wasn't set up correctly. My final guideline is on decision making. So how do we go from our analysis and all this great creation process and make the right decision? And my guideline here is to be careful of launching on neutral. Now, what does launching on neutral mean? And what I mean here is, yes, don't be the cat, don't launch yourself into the air. So launching on neutral means, and I put neutral in quotes. Why is that? And as I talked about power, right, I said we have an 80% chance to detect this effect. So let's say we're powered for 7 days to detect a 3% increase, as we were. Well, what if there was a 1% increase? Well, we were only powered 80% to detect a 3% increase, so you're pretty unlikely to detect a 1% increase. But that also means you're unlikely to detect a 1% decrease. So neutral could really be, you could have had a negative impact that's too small to detect. So that's why I put neutral in quotes. What are some considerations when deciding whether to launch a neutral? First is, what's the technical complexity in the debt you're adding? Was this a heavily engineered feature? That means this is going to all stack up one day into a big house of cards that's going to collapse on some poor engineer in 2 years. Is it a foundational feature? Is this something that's going to enable you to run other tests that you have in the pipeline? For example, maybe you change something on the course page, and instead of adding something, we remove some stuff. Why did we remove it? Well, we had an idea. We wanted to fit user testimonials, social proof, but we didn't want to make the page too crowded. And we thought these parts of the page aren't adding value. So let's test removing that, kind of make sure that doesn't hurt much, and then try adding in these user testimonials. So that's an example of where that test, we may be more concerned with avoiding a negative impact than necessarily we need to see a big positive one. And as I mentioned, you want to be really careful, again, of thinking about, could there be something that, even if I didn't detect in 7 days, that 1% change over a year, could, if it's a decrease, could be pretty bad. And I would really recommend deciding beforehand whether to launch on neutral. It's very easy post hoc to justify kind of whatever decision you want to make, which usually you've run this experiment because you think it's going to be helpful. So you could say, oh, we spent all this engineering effort, sunk cost bias, we really just want to roll this out. And what I like to say here is what I'll do with our product managers is, let's say we roll out a test and we want to increase the number of people submitting a business demo requests. So we add little business demo requests, calls to action on parts of the site. And I'll ask someone, I'll get the results back, and maybe I had to do some custom analysis. And so I'll ask the team and I say, oh, what would have been success for you? I try to ask this beforehand. What would have been success? What percentage of people, what increase or what percentage of people submitting a form? So maybe, they'll say, oh, I think even just, right now it's like 0.5%. So even just, 1%, that would have been really successful if we just get that, that much more. And I'd say, well, then that translates into 50 more requests a day. That's what success means to me. And I'll say, oh, it turns out we only got 2. Guess what happens next? Oh, well, I mean, like 2 more is better than none, and that was an increase, and so I really think we should just roll this out. And so that's where, again, it's really helpful to make these decisions before you see the numbers. Wrapping up, the 6 guidelines I talked about today. First is prioritizing, and my guideline here is to calculate the potential increase. So how many new conversions would you get a day if it worked? And doing this based on what's the population of your test, what's their current conversion rate, what's the increase you expect to see. Next is to run a power calculation. So calculating how long would it take you to get 80% power to detect that increase. Work on smaller incremental tests. Don't have these really long cycles where you're working on this big change, and then if it fails, you can't really be sure why, and you spent a lot of effort on it. And have a data scientist involved in the whole process, even from the beginning. When you're analyzing it, check on these health metrics, especially bucketing skew. They can really mess up your results. And be careful of launching on neutral, because again, neutral does, 1, not necessarily mean there was absolutely no difference. And 2, you should really think about some other considerations, like what tech debt is this adding, or is this foundational? To wrap up, I want to share some resources. These slides, of course, will all be shared afterwards, so you don't need to frantically write these down. But I just wanted to share some research papers that I found really helpful as I started beginning on my A/B testing journey. So these are a couple. The last one here you might recognize from this morning, democratizing online controlled experiments. Lucas is very excited. And these other ones, I really like them because they're, A/B testing papers can run the gamut. Sometimes they can be really mathematical and niche, but I like these. These are very practical. They're kind of written in plain English, and I think they can be very helpful. And there's a few blog posts I like too. So Dan McKinley, who did that, the slides I showed you near the beginning about moving from in 2008, having these long life cycles to 2015, shorter cycles. He's done some great presentations on experiments. It's a nice thing from Jonathan Park on scaling Airbnb's platform. Maybe my favorite title is Please, Please Don't A/B Test That, about when is the appropriate time to use A/B tests. And finally, how Etsy handles peaking in A/B tests, so exactly the problem Lizzie talked about. And with that, thank you all so much for coming here. If you want to learn a little bit more about me, you can follow me on Twitter. You can find my blog where I've written about A/B testing and some links to the other presentation. And with that, I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. I'll grab that from you. We'll shake hands. We'll do this. That's good. OK, let's jump in then. How do you accurately estimate estimated impact? People that want to push their tests through can use this as the wild card.
Yeah, so I think that's a great point, right? If someone's like, oh, well, I know I don't have that much traffic and my rate isn't that high, but this is going to triple conversion rate. So part of it is keeping each other honest. So one thing right now so it's interesting, it's handled differently at Etsy and at DataCamp. So at Etsy, I worked on the search team. The internal search, so Etsy has over 45 million items. You search jewelry. How do we show which 2 million items, 2 million jewelry items in what order, and what does that search page look like? And there actually, because we'd been testing for a while, we did a flat 1% increase in conversion rate. So every test idea, 1%. So then it really was just the population. At DataCamp, it's a bit different. We're newer to A/B testing, and so we really might have these 5, 10%, 15% increases. And so DataCamp right now, it's mostly the growth team running experiments, and so we'll keep each other honest. So we'll have a bit of a debate, and we'll also ask, all right, what's the evidence you have for this? Do you have any prior tests, maybe on a different part of the site that made this change? Do you have some psychology research? Do you see this happening at other companies, et cetera? So I don't know that there's a silver bullet for this, but I think those are a couple ways that can help with this problem.
All right, well, TON has another acronym for us. If you know the hippo, you're probably also familiar with the zebra. Zero evidence, but really arrogant.
I had actually not heard that, so I like this new term.
So weird. So if you're new to A/B testing, the last speaker spoke about data scientists analyzing results. Isn't that what companies like VWO, Optimizely, and others do?
Yeah. So I will say, so both at Etsy and at DataCamp, we use our own in-house experimentation platform. But that being said, at Etsy, we sort of had built up over the years something similar to Optimizely, right? All the metrics were calculated. You had a nice interface. It ran these health checks, et cetera. So I think somewhat similar to Optimizely. And it's true, but the other thing is that, as I said, the data scientist is not just helpful for taking those numbers. They can also help you with the parts further up the funnel. So if you put something, it's kind of this garbage in, garbage out idea. So if you're testing things that aren't, as Lucas talked, hypothesis driven, you're just sort of randomly throwing stuff. If you're trying things on part of the site that are not really well trafficked, a good analytics tool is not going to save you from that. But that's why it can help to have someone in person, like a data scientist, helping do that. And the final answer is, not every company uses one of these other platforms, and so a data scientist might also help with a really intricate custom analysis. I don't know, some kind of weird funnel that wouldn't come pre-built in an experimentation tool.
So do you think it's okay to make multiple changes on a single page as long as all the changes support the same hypothesis, like readability of content?
Yeah, I think that can be okay. I think, again, part of it is, it's always hard to tell what interactions might be. If, especially something readability of content, It's like, okay, readability of content, so we change the header, make that more readable, we change the description, make that more readable, these things, but again, maybe one of them works, one of them doesn't. That being said, being realistically, you don't want to, you wouldn't A/B test like changing, you want to change 10 words. You wouldn't change 1 word at a time, right? It wouldn't make sense. So there are also some changes that are only going to make sense bundled together. And that's okay, as long as you acknowledge that. You're saying, we would never roll this out without this other change anyway, so they come as a package deal. So I think in that case, you can absolutely test multiple changes at once.
So what suggestions do you have to test before launching like a complete redesigned website?
Yeah, so I think the presentation from Ancestry.com was pretty good, like talking about how they iterated through that. The other thing is I'll point into Dan McKinley's presentation. It wasn't a completely redesigned website, but he gave the example of they tested infinite scroll on Etsy. So basically, as you scroll down the search results would keep populating. You never like page over to another page. Spent months implementing that. They ran the test. It didn't work. So how could they have incrementally gotten there? What they could have done is tested the assumptions. So one assumption there is page speed. Making the page faster is going to be a better experience. How do they test that? They actually didn't speed up the site. They slowed it down. Instead of that, have a negative impact. Another assumption, more results are better. All right, a lot easier than infinite scroll. Change the number of results from 40 to 60. So again, really trying to break down what may seem like one change, infinite scroll, and saying, why do we think that change would be better?
Interesting. So if a prototype doesn't have the normal quality of code, isn't that handicapping a test in the first stages that may actually be a winner once it's built out?
Yeah, so I think that's a great point. One thing I want to emphasize is quality of code that, it shouldn't affect the user experience, right? It shouldn't be something that would, make this iteration slower than it would be if you had better code, or, that the copy doesn't look as good. But, it might be quality of code quality of code can be helpful for the engineers. Code can be more maintainable, right? It can be more readable. And that sort of thing, it won't impact a user. So it shouldn't make a difference in your test results, whether you run it with not the, perfect engineering style code until you validate that it works, and then the engineer can go back and change that.
Okay, so our last question. What do you find most frustrating about working with marketers who are not data scientists? How can we mitigate?
Yeah, so I do have to say I have a little bit of a unique experience as a data scientist here, because at Etsy I worked with the search team, and so pretty data savvy folks, both because Etsy was pretty data driven, and some of the search team were the ranking engineers, say machine learning. And at DataCamp, as a data science online education company, you might not be surprised, our marketers and the teams are pretty data savvy, and a lot of them code. But I think how we can mitigate that is, I think, and a good data scientist should help you do this, but I think often people might come with a data question. They're like, all right, how many people, register on this part of the site? How many people do this? But it can turn out that the data answer for that is not what you really needed. So hopefully, again, a data scientist helps do that. But it's OK to come to the data scientist and say, hey, I have this business question. Where do you think I should look? So actually not, you might think it's being helpful, and it can be, but working with them to make that translation. Because they can also say, hey, actually this, if we want to, ideally we would look at this. This would take me 20 hours, but this gets us most of the way there, and I can get you that in 30 minutes. And that's really helpful to work on that process together.
All right, well, thank you so much, Emily. Appreciate it. I'll shake
Thank
your
you
hand
all.
again officially. So